The wind came down from the high passes of the Colorado Rockies on the night of November 14th, 1873, and it carried the hard promise of iron. It did not howl. It pressed. It pressed against the timbered walls of Promise Creek, like a hand laid flat on a man's chest, testing for the beat beneath. Snow had been falling for 2 days, and the drifts on the north side of every barn stood as tall as a grown man's shoulder. Cattle had been brought in. Wood had been stacked. The valley was bracing for what the old-timers were already calling the worst blizzard in 20 years, and on the porch of a small homestead at the edge of town, 2 old women stood in front of a closed door. They were 62 years old, twins, identical. Their hair had gone the color of wood smoke long ago, and they wore it in the same tight braids beneath the same plain gray bonnets. Their faces were lined the same way at the corners of the mouth and the corners of the eyes, the kind of lines a person earns by spending 60 years watching the weather and refusing to flinch. They stood with their backs straight. They did not pound on the door. They did not call out. They did not weep. Each of them held a single flour sack. The wind pushed at the hem of their wool coats and found the gaps in the weave and went looking for bone. Inside the cabin behind that closed door, a man was holding the iron latch down with both hands, even though no one was trying to come in. His name was Ezra Halloway. He was their younger brother. He was 58 years old, and he had just done the thing he had been working toward in secret for almost a year. He had thrown his sisters out into the storm. He stood there with his palms pressed against the wood, listening for the sound of them giving up. He listened for the soft thump of a body falling against the door. He listened for the begging. None of it came. After a long time, he heard nothing at all but the wind, and he understood that they had walked away. He told himself he had done a hard thing for a good reason. He told himself again and again that the Lord helps those who help themselves, and that a man's first duty is to his own future, and that what he had done was not murder. It was simply leaving the matter in God's hands. He told himself many things that night. None of them would still be true by morning. Out on the path that led down toward the mountain road, the 2 old women were already gone from sight, swallowed by the white. Now, before this story can move forward, you have to understand how it began. You have to understand who these 2 women were, and why a town full of decent church-going Americans had decided to look the other way, while one of their own neighbors handed 2 of their elders a pair of flour sacks and pointed them at a blizzard. Their names were Prudence and Tamsin Halloway, and they had been born in Promise Creek in the spring of 1811, in a one-room cabin that no longer stood. Their father had been a millwright who came west on the strength of a rumor and a wagon, and their mother had been the daughter of a Massachusetts preacher who could read 4 languages and speak none of them out loud. The fever took both parents the year the girls turned 10. The fever took a great many people that year. After the burying was done, the girls were taken in by an uncle who was already old then, and who raised them the way he raised his cattle, with shelter and silence and a basic measure of feed. He died when they were 22. He left them the cabin and the 40 acres around it, and a younger brother to look after a boy of 18 named Ezra. The girls had already been running the homestead for years by then. The transition was so quiet that nobody in town quite noticed it had happened. Prudence married first. She was 24. The man's name was Bartholomew Halloway. And yes, by the strange accident of frontier surnames, he carried the same family name as her own. He was a cousin from a different branch of the line, a copper miner with steady hands and a low voice. He courted her for 2 summers without ever once raising his expectations. When he asked her, she said yes, and she said it the same way she said everything which was once and then never again. Tamsin did not marry. There was a young man for a time, a surveyor passing through, and then there was no young man, and Tamsin never spoke of it. She stayed in the cabin. She kept the kitchen. She raised the chickens and the small herd of milk goats, and she tended the herb garden behind the smokehouse with a patience that bordered on religious. She and her sister continued, as they had always done, to think the same thoughts at the same time, to reach for the same tools without speaking, to move through the chores of the homestead like two halves of a single quiet machine. Bart and Prudence had one child, a son. He lived for 9 months, and then he did not. Prue did not speak of him for a long time after that. Tamsin would later say to one person only once that her sister had not cried that whole first year, and that the not crying had been the worst part of all of it. Bart Truart Halloway died in the spring of 1843. He was 34 years old. There had been a collapse at the lower tunnel of the Bishop's Reach mine, and Bart had been the foreman on the day shift, and when the timbers came down, he was the only man on his side of the cave-in still standing. There were 3 other men trapped in the dark. With him, 2 of them young, one of them a father of 4. Bart could have crawled out through the gap before the second collapse came. He had time. The men who survived would say later that they all knew he had time, but he stayed. He spent the next 4 hours digging the 3 of them out with his bare hands and a piece of broken pickaxe, and when the second collapse came, he was the only one underneath it. They brought him home on a board. Prudence Halloway washed her husband's face herself and combed his hair the way he liked it, and laid him in the front parlor of the cabin where he had once danced with her at their wedding. She did not weep then either. The whole town came. The men who had been saved came, and one of them, a Welshman named Owen Pike, stood at the foot of the coffin for an hour, and then left without a word, because there was nothing he knew how to say. Prue was 32 when her husband died. She did not marry again. She did not court any of the men who, in the careful way of small towns, eventually came around to suggest that perhaps she might. She moved her things into the second bedroom of the cabin, the one she shared with her sister as girls, and she and Tamsin took up where they had left off, as if a quiet door had simply closed and another had opened in the same wall. That was 30 years ago. They were 62 now. And in the 30 years between Bart's death and the night of the blizzard, the people of Promise Creek had grown to fear them. It is hard to say exactly when fear became the word for it. At first, they were only awed. 2 grown women who did not gossip and did not sing, and did not seek out the company of others who lived without men, in a country where a woman without a man was considered an unfinished thing. They worked their land. They paid their bills. They came to church on Sundays, sat in the back, sang the hymns in a low, steady voice, and went home. They nodded to their neighbors. They did not stop. But there were the other things, too. There was the way they read. They had the largest collection of books in the county, and none of it was poetry or scripture. They had agricultural pamphlets and almanacs and a geological survey that a student from back east had left at the boarding house and never come back for. They had a French treatise on cold-frame gardening that Prue had ordered through the mail. They had a battered hunter's journal Prue had bought for 50 cents at a swap meet in Denver, full of hand-drawn diagrams of snares and shelter construction, and the trapping of beaver in winter. They read these books in the evenings the way other people read the Bible, patiently, carefully, marking the margins. There was the way they worked. They did not need to speak to each other to coordinate any task. A man hauling firewood for them once stopped in the yard halfway between the woodpile and the door, because he had watched Tamsin bring a cup of water from the kitchen and arrive at the precise instant her sister working in the garden. 100 yards away, set down her hoe and turned around. The man crossed himself. He told the story at the saloon that night. The story grew. There was the way they watched. They would sit on the porch sometimes on a summer evening and not move for 2 hours, looking at the slope of the hill behind the cabin, or at the way the swallows came down to the creek to drink. They were not lazy. Anyone who knew them knew they were not lazy. They were studying. They were learning the country the way other people learn a face until they could read it in the dark. And there was the matter of the flood. In the spring of 1853, 20 years before this story properly begins, Prudence Halliway had walked into the general store one morning and told Otis Greaves, the man who ran it, that the creek was going to break its banks within 4 days and that the lower meadow needed to be evacuated. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain herself in detail. She said only that she had been watching the snowpack on the high peaks and that the warm rains coming up from the south were the wrong kind of rain, and that the ground was already saturated and could not take another inch. Otis Greaves had stared at her. He had asked her how she could possibly know such a thing. She had said, "I have been keeping a record." He did not believe her. Nobody believed her. But Otis was a careful man, and his wife had a soft spot for the Halliway sisters. And so when his wife begged him to at least move the chickens to the high barn, he did. 3 other families, mostly the wives, did the same. 4 days later, on the morning of April the 11th, the South Fork of Promise Creek came over its banks at 3 o'clock in the morning and took out 12 houses, 8 barns, the lower bridge, and 17 head of cattle. It would have been worse. The 4 families who had moved their livestock to high ground lost almost nothing. The 3 children of the Henderson family who had been made to sleep at the parsonage on Prue's specific recommendation lived through the night. Promise Creek should have called Prudence Halliway a hero. That is not what Promise Creek did. There was a young preacher in town that year. He had only just arrived. His name was Obadiah Thresher, and he was 35 years old, and he had a face like a bone-handled knife. He was new to the West, and he understood in the bright and dangerous way that ambitious men understand such things, that a frontier town did not need a preacher who explained the Lord's mercy. It needed a preacher who explained the Lord's wrath. He preached his first big sermon the Sunday after the flood. He did not talk about the families who had been saved. He talked about the strange, silent woman who had known what was coming. He talked about the kind of knowledge that does not come from books or prayer. He talked about how in the old country, in the old days, there had been women who knew things they should not have known, and how the wise men of those times had understood that such knowledge had a price and a source and a name. He never said the word out loud. He did not have to. The town heard it. From that Sunday forward, Prudence Halliway was no longer a neighbor who had saved the lives of 3 children. She was something else, something the town did not have a clean word for but had a clean feeling about. The feeling was fear, and fear in a small American town in the year 1853 is the kind of seed that grows for a long time underground before it ever shows above the soil. 20 years it grew. Now we come back to the autumn of 1873. In the second week of October, Prue and Tamsin had finished a project they had been planning since spring. They had built a cold frame against the south wall of the smokehouse, using salvaged window glass scrap lumber and a series of hinged shutters insulated with sheep's wool. They had banked it with manure for warmth, and they had filled it with seedlings of winter lettuces, kale, and a hardy variety of carrot they had been selecting for cold tolerance for almost a decade. They had done this in plain sight. They were not hiding it. There was nothing to hide. The methods were drawn directly from the French treatise that any literate person in town could have read if they had cared to. The first hard frost came on the night of October 28th. It killed every garden in Promise Creek. It did not kill the Halliway garden. By the second week of November, when every other family in town was eating from the root cellar, and the Salt Barrel Prudence and Tamsin Halloway were carrying baskets of fresh greens to their kitchen. The greens were small. They were pale, but they were real. They were green leaves in November in the high Rockies, and the smell of them was the smell of something that should not have been possible. Word got around. Of course it did. A boy who delivered hay to the homestead saw the cold frame and told his mother. The mother told the women at the church social. The story moved through the town like fire moves through dry grass. By the third Sunday of November, Reverend Thresher was preaching about it from the pulpit. He did not name the Halloways. He did not have to. "There is a kind of harvest," he said, his voice low and steady, the way he liked it when he wanted the room to lean forward, "that the Lord did not plant. There is a kind of green that grows where green should not grow. And brothers and sisters, when you see such a thing, you must ask yourself a question. You must ask yourself, where did that green come from? Whose hand fed it? And in whose ledger is the price of it being recorded?" The town listened. The town had been listening to him for 20 years now. And the town had grown so used to the sound of his voice that it had forgotten how to disagree with it. Heads nodded. Women looked at each other. Men cleared their throats. After the service, on the front steps of the church, Reverend Obadiah Thresher took Ezra Halloway by the elbow and walked him a little way apart and said something to him in a low, kind voice that no one else heard. Ezra nodded once. He did not look at the preacher's face. This is the part of the story that nobody in Promise Creek would have known that night or for many years afterward. What the preacher said to Ezra Halloway on the church steps was the second half of a conversation that had begun in the parsonage in private 11 months earlier. Reverend Thresher was a thief. He had been stealing from the church for almost 6 years. The amounts had been small at first, the kind of money a man can lose on a card table in a single bad evening. But the amounts had grown. He had been moving the funds through a personal account in a Denver bank, and he had been spending them on a woman in that same city whose name and existence the people of Promise Creek would never have permitted him to acknowledge. By the autumn of 1873, the missing total was a little over $800, which in that year was the price of a working farm with a horse and plow. Ezra Halloway, the younger brother, the one nobody paid much attention to, had a different problem. Ezra had been quietly approached the previous spring by an agent of the Denver Pacific Railroad. The agent had explained over a glass of warm whiskey at the boarding house that the railroad was surveying a new spur line that would run north out of Denver and through the high valleys, and that the most efficient route ran straight across the lower 40 acres of the Halloway homestead. The railroad was prepared to pay $14,000 for that land. Cash and gold. Paid on the day of transfer. There was only one condition. The land had to be transferred by a single owner with clean and uncontested title. The railroad would not touch a property held jointly by 3 siblings, 2 of whom were unmarried women with their own legal claim. They had been burned by such arrangements before. They wanted one signature and a clear deed. Ezra had spent 3 weeks not sleeping. Then he had gone to see the preacher. The conversation in the parsonage had gone like this. Ezra had laid it out plain. He had a problem. The preacher had a problem, and the 2 problems looked at from a certain angle fit together. If the preacher could find a way, a holy way, a way that the town would believe and accept to remove Prue and Tamsin from the homestead, then the deed would clear, the railroad would pay, and Ezra would give the preacher half of everything. $7,000. Enough to put the church books right, and then some. Enough to make the whole problem go away. The preacher had listened. He had taken a long time to answer. Then he had said in his low and steady voice, The Lord works in many ways, Brother Halloway. Sometimes he uses the weather. That was the agreement. They shook hands on it. Neither of them ever wrote it down. The cold frame was the gift they had been waiting for. It was the proof, the public proof, the visible and undeniable proof that the Halloway sisters were not what they should have been. The preacher would set the town's mood. The brother would do the rest. And the storm, when it came, would be the hand of God. The storm came on November 14th. Ezra waited until the wind picked up in the early afternoon. He waited until he could see the gray wall of snow coming down the pass, like a slow, grinding curtain. Then he went into the front room of the cabin, where his sisters were sitting at the table, mending a torn quilt. And he said in a voice that did not sound like his own, "I need you both to come with me to the front door." They looked up at him, just looked. They did not ask why. He had 2 flour sacks ready by the boot bench. He had put a small portion of dried venison and a heel of bread in each one. He picked them up. He held them out. He said, "There has been a meeting. The town has had a meeting. It has been decided." He could not look at their faces. He told them about the meeting. He told them about the cold frame and the talk and the preacher's worry. He told them that the matter was no longer in his hands. He used those exact words. "Out of my hands." He said that he was sorry. He said that the Lord would provide. He said that there was a path over the pass, and that if they walked steady, they might make it to the next valley by morning, and that there were Christian people there who would take them in. They listened. They did not interrupt him. When he was finished, Tamsin reached out and took her sack, and Prudence reached out and took hers, and they put on their wool coats and their bonnets, and they walked to the door, and Ezra opened it for them, and the wind came in like a fist. On the porch, Prudence stopped. She turned. She looked at her brother. She had gray eyes the same shade as her sister's, and in the white light of the storm, they looked like 2 small pieces of polished iron. She did not raise her voice. She did not curse him. She said only one sentence to him, and she said it slowly, so that he would remember every word of it for the rest of his life. She said, "Ezra, you will live long enough to regret this." Then she turned and she stepped down off the porch into the snow, and her sister followed her, and the door closed behind them, and the iron latch clicked home. Ezra Halloway stood with his palms against that door, and his hands were not shaking yet, but they would be. He stood there for a long time. He told himself he had done a hard thing for a good reason. The wind pressed at the cabin walls. Outside on the front step, the 2 flour sacks left behind a single set of overlapping boot prints in the fresh snow, and the storm began very patiently to fill them in. What Ezra did not know, what no one in Promise Creek knew, what Reverend Obadiah Thresher in his bone-handled certainty did not know, was that the meeting on the church steps had not been the first warning his sisters had received. 3 weeks earlier, on a cold night at the end of October, a 16-year-old boy named Wendell Pike had been crouched in the alley behind the parsonage, doing what he often did, which was nothing in particular. Wendell was the son of Owen Pike, the Welsh miner, who had been one of the 3 men Bart Halloway died saving in the cave-in of 1843. Owen Pike had lived 12 more years after that day, long enough to marry late to father 1 son and to die slowly of black lung. Before he died in the last clear hour of his last clear morning, Owen had taken his boy by both shoulders and said, "If anything ever happens to those 2 old women up at the Halloway place, you go. You don't ask. You don't think. You go. Do you understand me, son?" Wendell had understood. He had been 6 years old, and he had understood. The town thought Wendell was simple. The town was wrong. Wendell did not speak much because Wendell had nothing he wanted to say to most of the people who asked him questions. But Wendell listened. Wendell listened to everything. And on that cold night at the end of October, Wendell heard through the thin back window of the parsonage the voices of Reverend Thresher and Ezra Halloway speaking in low tones about a railroad and a deed in a storm. The next morning, Wendell walked out to the Halloway homestead. He did not knock. He went around to the back where Prue was splitting kindling, and he stood there until she looked up. Then he told her in plain words exactly what he had heard. Prudence Halloway did not flinch. She did not gasp. She set down the axe. She thanked him. She asked him 3 quiet questions, and he answered all 3. Then she went inside and told her sister. That was 3 weeks before the blizzard. In the 3 weeks between that morning and the night Ezra opened the door, Prudence and Tamsin Halloway did a great many things that no one in Promise Creek noticed. They had, after all, been moving through the country in their quiet, coordinated way for 40 years. Nobody paid attention to them. Nobody saw what they did. That had always been the price of being feared. It had also now become the source of their advantage. They went up the mountain. Prudence had been mapping the limestone formations on the ridge above Promise Creek for almost 5 years. She had a hand-drawn map of the area folded in a small tin box in her dresser. She had made the map herself on her supposedly aimless afternoon walks, the kind of walks the town had long ago stopped trying to understand. The map was meticulous. It showed every outcrop, every stream, every shelf of stone. In one place at the base of a sheer wall on the far side of a hidden ravine, the map was marked with a single word. The word was breath. She had written it because of something she had read in the Geological Survey. A dry sentence buried halfway through a chapter on subsurface formations. The sentence said that limestone karst systems in regions of geothermal activity often produced caves whose internal temperatures remained stable year-round, regardless of the surface conditions, and that such caves sometimes exhaled visible vapor in cold weather, like the breath of a sleeping animal. Prudence had gone looking for that breath. She had found it 3 winters earlier on a January walk, a shadow in the rock, a column of warm mist rising into the freezing air. She had crawled inside. She had stayed for 2 hours. When she came out, she had walked straight home and told her sister very calmly that she had found something they should keep to themselves. For 3 years, they had kept it. It had been their secret, their place, the place the world did not know about. In the 3 weeks after Wendell Pike's warning, that secret place became the center of a careful and methodical relocation. 3 times a week before dawn, Prue and Tamsin would load a small handcart with supplies and walk it up the back trail to the cave. They moved tools, a kettle, a stone griddle, sacks of flour, a jar of sourdough starter, bundles of dried herbs, a canister of lamp oil, a second kettle, spools of strong thread, knives, a small adze, an axe head wrapped in oilcloth, the hunter's journal, the Geological Survey, the almanac, the French treatise on cold frames, a box of seeds saved from every harvest of the past decade, sealed in wax against moisture, a folding pair of reading spectacles, 2 heavy wool blankets, a small hand mirror, a tin of needles, a locket that had belonged to their mother. They moved everything that mattered to them. They left nothing behind that they could not afford to lose. By the night of November 14th, when their brother held out the 2 flour sacks at the front door of the cabin was already a shell. The things inside it were the things they had decided to leave behind. They had been waiting for the storm. They had known from the moment Wendell Pike had spoken to Prue in the woodpile that this was coming. They had known what their brother would do. They had known what the preacher would say. They had known the day almost to the hour. when the door would close behind them. The storm was the only variable, and the storm had arrived right on schedule. So when Ezra opened the door and pointed them at the pass, he was not, as he believed, sending them to die. He was opening the door of a house they were already finished living in. He was handing them 2 flour sacks of food they did not need. He was pointing them with the solemn weight of a man delivering a verdict in the direction of a place they had been quietly walking toward for 3 weeks. Out on the front step in the moment before she turned to look at her brother for the last time, Prudence Halloway had felt her sister's hand brush against her own, and the two of them had known without a word exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. They were going home. The wind pressed against them. The snow filled the prints behind them. The light was already beginning to fail. Ezra Halloway, on the wrong side of the door, listened for the sound of his sister's giving up, and heard nothing and would never understand for the rest of his life what that nothing had really meant. He thought he had won. He had not won. He had in fact just lost a game that had not even properly started yet. The game would last 30 years. By the time it was over, Reverend Obadiah Thresher would be dead in a prison cell in Canyon City. Ezra himself would have signed away every acre of the land he had killed his sisters to take. The town of Promise Creek would have buried a number of its dead in the ground his sisters had taught it how to farm, and would have eaten in the lean years to come a great deal of bread baked in a stone oven inside a cave that did not officially exist on any map. And on a slab of pale limestone at the mouth of that cave, a stonemason would one day carve 4 words. He would not carve their names. He would not carve their dates. He would carve only the 4 words that the town in the end would agree was the only honest thing anyone could say about them. He would carve the words they fed the people. But all of that was still to come, still too. For now, on the night of November 14th, 1873, 2 old women in gray bonnets and thin wool coats walked down off the porch of a cabin they would never enter again, and turned not toward the mountain, past their brother had pointed them at, but toward the hidden ravine on the far side of the ridge. They walked slowly. They walked carefully. They did not hurry because hurrying was for people who were lost. They were not lost. The blizzard closed around them like a curtain dropping at the end of an act. And somewhere inside the cabin behind them, a man with the wrong kind of warmth on his hands was already, without knowing it, beginning the long and patient work of paying for what he had just done. The path down off the porch dropped away into a country that had forgotten it was a country. There was no road. There were no fences. There was no horizon. The wind had taken every familiar shape in the world and ground it down into a single white roar, and the 2 old women walking through it could see at any given moment only what was immediately in front of them: the shoulder of a snow-covered juniper, the dark line of a dry creek bed, the toe of a worn boot pushing forward into another inch of fresh snow. They walked single file, Prudence in front, Tamsin 3 steps behind her with her left hand clenched around the edge of her sister's coat, where the fabric bunched at the small of the back. They had agreed on this without discussing it. They had agreed on most things in their lives without discussing them. If one of them went down, the other would feel it through the cloth before she heard it, and the going down would not become a losing. The cold came for them the way it comes for any living thing that doesn't have walls around it. It came for the face first. It numbed the cheeks and the lips until the mouth felt like an object that belonged to someone else. It came for the hands. Tamsin had her right hand curled around the neck of her flour sack, and within 20 minutes of leaving the porch, she could no longer feel the rough weave of the burlap. She knew she was holding the sack only because her arm was bent. The cold went up the wrists. The cold went down the spine. The cold sat down inside the chest and made itself at home. They did not stop. They did not speak. Prudence was navigating by memory. The map she had drawn over 5 years of patient walking was not in the tin box at her dresser. It had not been in the tin box for some time. It was in her head. It was the angle of the ridge against the gray sky, which she could just make out as a darker shape inside the white. It was the particular twist of a stand of dead pines half fallen against each other that she had used as a marker since the first summer she had come this way. It was the long, slow descent into the dry creek bed, and the way the creek bed bent left and then bent left again and then opened into the hidden ravine. The hidden ravine was where the wind died. She had counted on this in the long evenings of planning. She had told her sister about it. The ravine was deep and narrow and protected on 3 sides, and the storm could not get down into it the way it could get at everything else. When they came down off the lip of the dry creek and into that sheltered cut in the earth, the wind dropped from a roar to a whisper in the space of a single step. And both sisters stopped and stood and breathed. Tamsin breathed in the way a person breathes when she has been running underwater for a long time and has finally found the surface. Her chest heaved. Her shoulders shook. She let go of her sister's coat and put both hands on her knees and bent forward and made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a laugh. Prudence put one hand very lightly on the back of her sister's neck. She did not say anything. There was nothing she needed to say. After a minute, Tamsin straightened up. She nodded once. They went on. The mouth of the cave was where Prudence had said it would be. It was not a grand entrance. It was a crack in the limestone no taller than a man, half hidden by the low sweep of an old juniper tree. The snow had drifted up against one side of it, but the other side was clear. And there was a darkness in the rock that was not the darkness of the storm. It was a different darkness, a waiting darkness. A darkness that had a still air inside it, and a smell faint but unmistakable of damp earth and old stone, and something that was almost but not quite warmth. They stepped over the threshold. The wind behind them went on with its business. The wind had nothing to do with them anymore. They were inside. For a long moment, the 2 old women just stood there, in the entry passage with their backs against the cold wall of the storm, and the dim, quiet hollow of the cave opening up before them. Their eyes adjusted slowly. The first thing they could see 10 feet ahead of them in the dimness was a small lamp. It was a tin oil lamp with a brass collar. It was sitting on a flat shelf of rock at hip height. Beside it on the same shelf was a tinderbox, a striker, a small jar of lamp oil, and a folded square of dry sailcloth. Prudence walked to the shelf. Her fingers were so numb that she had to use both hands to manage the striker. But she had practiced this in the dark before, with her eyes closed at the kitchen table on summer nights, and her hands remembered what her fingers could not feel. The spark caught. The wick took. A small yellow flame stood up inside the brass collar, and the cave became a place with edges and shadows and walls. She lifted the lamp. The passage went on for 40 feet, then opened. What it opened into was not a hollow in the rock. It was a chamber the size of a barn, and the chamber had a high ceiling that vanished into shadow. And at the far end of the chamber where the ceiling came down and met a level shelf of stone, there were things. There was a stack of cordwood neatly cut, neatly piled. There were 3 large iron pots nested one inside the other. There was a cast iron griddle leaning against the wall. There was a folding camp table with the legs collapsed and the surface laid against the stone. There were 2 oilcloth bundles the size of small barrels lashed with rope. There were sacks of flour. There was a sack of cornmeal. There was a small barrel that, by the smell, had pickled pork in it. There was a coil of new rope. There was an axe with the head wrapped in greased cloth. There was an adze. There were 3 wool blankets folded stacked on a low stone. There was a tin box of needles. There was a leather-bound journal on top of the box with a pencil tied to it by a length of waxed string. There was a small clay jar with a sealed wax lid. The wax lid had a thumbprint pressed into it. The thumbprint was Tamsin's. The jar held the sourdough starter she had been keeping alive on the back of her stove for 19 years. There was a great deal more than that. The 2 sisters did not need to look at all of it that night. They knew what was there. They had put it there themselves 3 sled loads at a time before dawn on every cold morning of the last 3 weeks. Tamsin sat down on the floor of the cave. She sat down hard. She put her palms flat on the stone, and she let her head hang forward. She did not weep. She did not laugh. She breathed. The air down on the floor of the chamber away from the entry passage was warmer than the air outside by something close to 30 degrees. It was not a warmth a person would have called warm on any ordinary winter day. It would have been the chill of a root cellar in summer. But to a body that had just walked 4 miles through a blizzard in a thin wool coat, that root cellar chill was the difference between life and death, and Tamsin's body knew it before her mind did. The shaking, the deep and uncontrollable shaking that had begun in the dry creek bed and had ridden her shoulders all the way down the ravine, started very slowly to ease. Prudence set the lamp down on the camp table. She crossed the chamber. She knelt beside her sister. She helped her sister out of the wet wool coat and laid the coat across a stone where it would dry. She unfolded one of the wool blankets and put it around her sister's shoulders. She did all of this without speaking, and when she was done, she sat down on the stone next to Tamsin and pulled the same blanket around her own back. And the 2 of them sat there together in the lamplight for what could have been a minute or could have been an hour, listening to the silence of the cave and the very faint, far-off, irrelevant sound of the wind outside. After a while, Tamsin said, "We're alive." Prudence said, "Yes." Tamsin said, "He thinks we're not." Prudence looked at the lamp. She looked at the stack of cordwood. She looked at the small clay jar with her sister's thumbprint pressed into the wax lid. Then she looked at her sister, and a small, dry, almost unwilling smile moved across her mouth. She said, "Let him." That was the first night. The first week was the work week. There is a thing that happens to people who have been hunted out of their own house and who arrive at the end of a long fear. In a place where nobody is hunting them anymore, the fear does not leave. The fear converts. It becomes work. It becomes the kind of focused, methodical, almost holy work that does not stop to ask why and does not stop to congratulate itself. The Halloway sisters had been preparing for this work for 3 weeks, and in some sense, in the deeper sense that mattered, they had been preparing for it for 40 years. The cave was the first place they had ever lived in where they did not have to keep one ear cocked for the sound of someone disapproving of them. The cave did not disapprove. The cave only asked very quietly that they be useful. They were useful. By the end of the first day, they had identified the cave's 3 largest assets. The first was the geothermal warmth which came up through the stone and which they could feel most strongly in a lower chamber down a sloping passage to the south of the main hall. The second was the water. There was a small spring on the east wall of the lower chamber, where snowmelt and groundwater filtered down through the limestone and pooled in a basin the size of a washtub before slipping away under the rock and out into some unseen channel below. The water was clean. The water was cold. The water was not frozen and would not freeze. The third asset was the ceiling of the main chamber, which was not solid. There was a long fissure that opened to the sky some 60 feet overhead, narrow enough that snow could not pile up in it, but wide enough that in the daytime, a column of pale gray light came down through it and made a soft, indirect daylight in the chamber below. Smoke would rise straight up that fissure, as if it had been engineered for the purpose. They had a chimney. They had not built it. The mountain had built it for them. By the end of the second day, they had laid the footprint of their cabin. It would be a small cabin, 12 feet by 16, built directly underneath the fissure on the level shelf at the south end of the main chamber, with the back wall of the cabin set against the natural stone of the cave wall, so that the stone itself would serve as one side of the structure, and they would only have to build the other three. They had no proper saw. They had no full axe handle. What they had was the small adze, the wrapped axe head, which they fitted to a length of cured ash. They had cached in the cave the previous spring a knife each, and the broken flat blades of shale they could chip from the cavern walls. It was enough. It was more than enough. There was a great deal of dead, seasoned timber in the hidden ravine outside fallen pines that had been curing in the dry mountain air for years, perfect for what they needed. They could not always get to it in the deep snow of those first weeks, but on the days when the wind dropped, they would go out together, and Prue would score a deep ring around a log with the adze, and they would lever the log against a stone outcropping until the dry wood snapped clean across the score, and then they would drag it back to the cave, one 10-foot section at a time, with rope harnesses they had cut from the coil. It was brutal work for two women in their 60s. It was the kind of work that a younger man would have called impossible and that a 30-year-old lumberjack would have done in a third of the time. They did not care how long it took. They had no employer. They had no foreman. They had only the work, and the work did not judge them. They notched the logs by hand. They had read about the technique in the Hunter's Journal Prue had bought at the swap meet in Denver. The journal had a long section on building winter shelter with diagrams of dovetail and saddle notches drawn in faded pencil by the long-dead trapper whose hand had filled the book. The sisters used the saddle notch because it was the simplest and the most forgiving of imperfect cuts. They cut, they fitted, they raised, they cut again. The first round of logs went down on the second morning. The fourth round went up on the sixth morning. By the end of the 11th day, they had walls. They built the chimney into the back wall against the natural stone. They had found in the cave wall behind the cabin site a narrow vent that twisted up through the rock and disappeared into darkness. Prue had spent the better part of an afternoon on her hands and knees, dropping a small twist of burning straw into the bottom of that vent and watching with great satisfaction as the smoke rose, did not blow back, and did not settle. The vent worked. The mountain had given them a flue. They lined the base of it with wet clay from the spring chamber, and they shaped a hearth and a firebox out of flat stones, bedded in the same clay. And the first fire they lit in that hearth on the morning of the 15th day drew so cleanly that the smoke went up the flue without a single curl back into the cabin, and Tamsin laughed out loud, which was a sound her sister had not heard her make in 11 years. They built the oven last. The oven was Tamsin's project. She had been thinking about it for years. She wanted a stone oven, a real one, the kind a French farmer's wife would have known by heart, with a low arched roof and a floor of flat-fired stones that would hold heat for hours after the fire had been raked out. She built it into the back wall of the cabin beside the chimney, fitting stones one to another with the patience of a woman who has been told her whole life that she has nothing better to do. She used the clay as mortar. She used wood ash to harden the clay. She fired the oven for 3 days, running slowly at first, and then hotter to drive every last bit of moisture out of the stone. and on the morning she pronounced it ready, she opened the small clay jar with her thumbprint on the wax, and she fed the starter, and she set a bowl of dough to rise on a shelf above the hearth where the air was warm. And she stood looking at that bowl for a long time, and her eyes were wet, but she did not let them spill. By the end of the 3rd week, they had a home. It was a small cabin inside a vast, dim, naturally tempered cathedral of stone. It was a shelter against the cold of the cave, and the cave itself was a shelter against the worse cold of the world above. They had a fire. They had a table. They had 2 narrow bunks built into the walls. They had pegs for their coats. They had a shelf for the books. They had set up against the far wall the leather-bound journal Prue had been keeping since the day she walked away from Ezra's porch, in which she had begun in her small, precise hand to record the date and the temperature and the weather and the work done. She had also recorded on the first page the words her brother had said to her at the door, exactly as he had said them. And beneath those words she had drawn a single horizontal line, and she had not written anything else on that subject again. The garden took longer. They had carried soil into the cave 1 bucket at a time. The rich black earth of the homestead's lower meadow, which they had been improving for 40 years with manure and ash and the bones of slaughtered chickens, was the most valuable thing they owned. And they had moved a great deal of it before the storm. They moved more in the first weeks on the days when the wind dropped enough to allow the trip. They mixed the meadow soil with bat guano. They scraped very carefully from the high ledges of a side passage where a small colony of brown bats slept through the winter. The guano was potent. The guano was free. Anyone who has farmed a poor patch of frontier ground for 40 years knows the value of free fertility. They built shallow troughs out of split timber and lined them with oilcloth. They set the troughs in the lower chamber where the geothermal warmth was strongest, and where by the lamplight the temperature held at a steady 52 degrees. Regardless of what the sky outside was doing, they planted the troughs with seeds from the wax-sealed box, lettuces, radishes, the hardy carrot, spinach, mustard greens, a small experiment with peas. They watered the troughs with the spring water carried in tin buckets. They set lamps near the troughs not for warmth, but for the small extra encouragement of light, and they waited. For days, nothing happened. Prudence began to keep a separate column in her journal for each trough, and a separate row for each day, and an entry in each cell that said, in increasingly cramped handwriting, "No growth." Then on the morning of the 8th day after planting, Tamsin came back from the lower chamber, and she did not say anything, but she looked at her sister, and her sister stood up from the table without a word and followed her down the sloping passage with the lamp in her hand. In the second trough on the left, 3 small spears of pale green had broken the soil. They were no longer than half an inch. They were the color of old jade. They were the most defiant thing either woman had seen in her lifetime. Prue and Tamsin stood over the trough for a long time, holding the lamp between them. And they did not speak because there was nothing in the language they had been raised in that would have said it correctly. Outside the cave, 10 miles down the valley and 4 feet deep in fresh snow, the town of Promise Creek was eating salt pork and praying. Inside the cave, in a wooden trough lit by a single oil lamp, 3 small green leaves were proving the town wrong. By the 2nd week of January, Tamsin pulled the first radish. She washed it in the spring. She cut it in half on the table. She handed 1/2 to Prudence. The 2 of them sat across from each other in the lamplight of the small cabin, and they ate the radish without speaking. And the sound of it, the sharp, wet crisp of the bite, was so loud in the silence of the cave that Prue would later swear in her dry, careful way that it had echoed. That same evening, Tamsin baked the first loaf of bread. She had been waiting for it. She had fed the starter for 3 days. The dough rose slow and patient on the shelf above the hearth. The oven fired since dawn held its heat. When she slid the loaf in on the wooden peel and sealed the door with wet clay, she sat down on the bench across from the oven and she watched it, the way a younger woman might watch a sleeping child. And she did not move for 40 minutes. When the bread came out, the smell of it filled the cabin. The smell drifted out the door of the cabin and across the open floor of the chamber and up into the great stone vault of the cave. And somewhere up at the level of the fissure, it must have escaped into the night air outside, because 2 days later, Wendell Pike would tell them with a kind of awe that he had been a quarter mile down the ravine setting a snare on the morning after the bake, and he had stopped in the snow and lifted his face and known with absolute certainty that someone had baked bread. Wendell came on the 17th day after the bread. He came alone. He came on snowshoes with a small sled behind him, and he did not call out. He stood at the mouth of the cave for a full minute before he stepped inside the way a man pauses at a doorway when he is not sure whether he is welcome. He came down the entry passage with his hat in his hand. When he saw the lamplight from the cabin in the main chamber, he stopped again. And he waited, and Prue came out onto the small porch they had built in front of the door. And she looked at him and she said very quietly, "Come in, Wendell. There is a fire." He came in. The cabin was warm. He had not been truly warm since November. He sat at the table, and Tamsin set a plate in front of him with 2 thick slices of dark bread and a small dish of butter she had made from the milk of the goats they had cached at a friendly farm 2 valleys over for safekeeping. And Wendell Pike, the boy, the town called Simple, the boy who did not waste his words, ate the bread very slowly with both hands, and when he was finished, he wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and he looked at Prue and he said, "I have something to tell you." She waited. He said, "My father told me a thing before he died. He told me if anything ever happened to you and Miss Tamsin, I was to come. I was to come without thinking. He made me promise." She nodded. She said, "I know. You came." He said, "He told me why." She said, "I know that too." He shook his head. He said, "No, Miss Prue. I don't think you do. He told me what your husband did. He told me about the cave-in. He told me your husband had time to crawl out and he didn't. He stayed. He stayed for my father. He stayed for the other 2, but my father always said it was him. Your husband stayed for the longest because my father was the last one out, and the second collapse came down on Mr. Bart not 3 feet from where my father had been standing." Wendell paused. He looked at his hands. He said, "My father said your husband saved his life. He said he lived 12 more years on borrowed time. He said I was the borrowed part. He said I shouldn't have ever been born, and that I was here because of Mr. Bart, and that meant I belonged to you. He made me promise." Prue was quiet for a long moment. She said, finally, "Wendell, you don't belong to anyone." He shook his head again. He said, "I know that's the modern way, but that's not how my father saw it, and that's not how I see it. I came because of him, but I'm staying because of you." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was on his face. He was 16 years old. He had the gentle, slightly absent look that the town had taken for slowness, and that Prue, who had been watching him since he was a baby, had always known to be something else entirely. He listened. He saw. He remembered. He simply did not waste his words on people who would not understand them. She said, "All right, Wendell." That was all. That was the whole agreement. It would last for 60 years. What Wendell brought to them beyond his own steady presence was the world. He brought news. He brought in his sled, the small things they could not easily get for themselves. A bag of salt, a spool of stronger thread, a new whetstone. He brought information. He told them in his slow, careful way about the state of the town, about who was sick, about who was hoarding, about the long, hard cough that had moved into the Henderson house and had not moved out, about the baby that had been born to the Cobb family the week before Christmas, and that was not nursing well because the mother had nothing in her milk. He told them with no inflection whatsoever that Reverend Thresher had preached 3 sermons since the storm on the subject of the Lord's deliverance through hardship, and that the congregation had been listening with thinner and thinner faces. He did not know yet that he had become the most important man in the valley. They knew it. They did not tell him. He would not have understood why. They sent things back with him. The first thing they sent was a single loaf of bread wrapped in clean linen, still faintly warm. Prue told him to take it to Asa Greaves, who ran the general store now that his father Otis had grown too old to manage the counter. Asa had been a boy of 10 the year of the flood. He had grown into a careful, watchful man with a thin mustache, and his father's habit of weighing every word before letting it go. Prue had calculated correctly that if there was a single man in Promise Creek who would understand what the loaf meant without needing it, explained it was Asa. Wendell took the loaf down. He left it on the counter. He said, "From the cave." Asa Greaves looked at the loaf for a long time. Then he picked it up. He smelled it. He broke off a small piece and tasted it. He stood there in the front of his store in the pale gray light of a January afternoon, with the snow piled up against the windows, and he did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then he went into the back. He came out with a sack of flour, a small jar of molasses, and a tin of black tea. He put them on the counter. He said to Wendell, "Tell them I will pay better next time. Tell them I am sorry it isn't more. Tell them I said, thank you." Wendell carried it back up the mountain. That was the beginning. By the end of January, the network was running. Asa Greaves had not said a word about the cave to anyone, but a certain kind of news has a way of moving through a snowed-in town without anyone needing to say it out loud. A woman would come into the store with a small bag of beans she could spare, and she would not look at Asa, and Asa would not look at her. And she would say in a voice pitched at the level of a private prayer that her youngest had not eaten a green thing in 2 months. And Asa would nod, and the beans would change hands. And 3 days later there would be a small bundle of carrots and a half loaf of bread waiting in the back of the store, with the woman's name pinned to it on a scrap of paper. And the woman would come and collect it, and she would not look at Asa. And Asa would not look at her, and neither of them would ever mention it to a living soul. It was the kind of arrangement that small towns invent when their official institutions have failed them, and they are not yet ready to admit it. The pattern grew. By the second week of February, more than a third of the families in Promise Creek were quietly trading anything for the food that came down from the cave. The goods they sent up were modest: a tin of lard, a few yards of muslin, a small coil of fence wire that Prue had wanted for the goat pen they were planning to build in the spring. The goods that came down were the difference between a fed child and a hungry one. The men of the town, by and large, did not speak of it. The men of the town, by and large, knew. Their wives were feeding them dark, dense, slightly sweet bread, of a quality none of them could have baked, and serving them small portions of pale lettuce and bright carrot in the dead of January. And a man who has been married for 20 years does not need to be told twice where such things have come from. He simply chews. He simply swallows. He simply does not say grace too loudly, because grace just now would feel like a small piece of theater. Reverend Obadiah Thresher noticed. He noticed first that his congregation was not as thin as it should have been. People who, by all the laws of malnutrition and disease, ought to have been laid out in their beds with the pneumonia, were sitting upright in the pews on Sunday morning. Children he had been preparing himself to bury were running slowly, but running in the snow behind the church after the service. His sermons on the Lord's deliverance through hardship were being received politely. Too politely. He was a man who had spent his whole career listening to congregations, and he could feel in the particular quality of the silence after the closing hymn that something was being kept from him. He began to ask questions. He asked them gently at first in the doorway of the church in a way that suggested only pastoral concern. "Mrs. Henderson, you are looking better than I had feared. The Lord is good. What has He sent your family this week?" "Mrs. Cobb, the baby is gaining weight." "I see. Praise Him. What has been on your table?" The answers came back vague. The answers came back too vague. By the last week of February, Reverend Obadiah Thresher had concluded two things. The first was that his sisters-in-law, as he privately and bitterly called them, were not dead. The second was that they were somehow feeding the town that had cast them out, and that the town in its hunger and its cowardice was letting them. This was unacceptable on every level he could name. It was unacceptable theologically, because it meant the Lord had not after all taken them in the storm, which suggested the Lord did not entirely agree with the preacher's sermon of November. It was unacceptable financially, because the railroad money depended on the deed clearing, and the deed could not clear if the deeded parties were demonstrably alive and actively occupying land in the county. And it was unacceptable personally, because every loaf of dark bread on every kitchen table in Promise Creek was a small, silent, inarguable rebuke to the man who had stood in the pulpit the November before and called those women a stain on the valley. He went to Ezra. He did not invite Ezra to the parsonage. He did not want to be seen. He went out to the homestead on a gray, cold morning at the end of February, and he sat at Ezra's kitchen table, and he told Ezra exactly what he had figured out. And he told Ezra what would be done about it. Ezra listened. Ezra had grown thinner over the winter. The skin under his eyes had become loose and dark. He had not been sleeping well. His wife Hester had not spoken more than 10 words to him since the night of November 14th. He sat at his own kitchen table, and he listened to the preacher. And when the preacher was finished, Ezra said, "How many men?" The preacher said, 12, the right 12. Ezra said, "When?" The preacher said, 2 days. We go up at first light. We bring lamp oil. We bring rifles in case there are dogs. We finish what was started in November. Ezra looked at the wall behind the preacher's head. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about his sister Prudence standing on the porch in her gray bonnet, looking at him with eyes the color of polished iron. He thought about the sentence she had spoken to him. He thought about the fact that he had not been able since that night to walk past the front door of his own house without flinching. Then he said, "All right, I'll bring the oil." 2 mornings later, in the cold blue hour before dawn, 12 men gathered in front of the church. They carried torches, they carried rifles, they carried in 3 separate cans 8 gallons of lamp oil. They were grim. They were quiet. They had been told by the preacher that they were going up the mountain to put an end to a sickness in the valley, and they had each in their own way agreed to believe him, because to disbelieve him would have meant to face the things their wives had been bringing home to them all winter, and to admit what those things were. Reverend Obadiah Thresher led them out of the churchyard and up the road toward the ridge. Ezra Halloway walked at his right hand with a 5-gallon can of lamp oil in his arms. The sun came up behind them gray and weak. They went into the trees. In the cave, Prudence Halloway was standing on the small porch in front of the cabin in the soft column of dawn light that came down through the fissure in the ceiling. And she was looking down toward the entry passage, with her head tilted slightly to one side. The way a person tilts her head when she is listening for something at the very edge of hearing. She had heard it before her sister had. She had heard the very faint, very far-off, almost imaginary sound of boots on snow. And beneath that sound, the softer sound of something else, of breath of metal, of the small percussion of a torch being knocked against a low branch. She turned her head. She looked back at the cabin, in the lower chamber, beyond the cabin, and down the sloping passage, her sister was kneeling beside a wooden trough, where a child of 4 years old lay wrapped in a wool blanket. The child's name was Ruth Cobb. Her mother had carried her up the ravine in the dark of the previous night, half mad with fear, because the child's fever had broken every herb Promise Creek had to offer, and the mother had nothing left. Tamsin had taken the child without asking a single question. The fever was down now. The breathing was easier. The child would live. The child would live, and 12 men with rifles and lamp oil were coming up the mountain, and Prudence Halloway, 62 years old, the widow of Bartholomew Halloway, the woman who had once 20 years before stood in a general store and quietly predicted a flood, stood very still on the porch of her cabin, inside a cave that did not exist on any map, and she listened to the sound of her brother and her preacher coming for her. And she did not move, and she did not call out, and she did not even for a single breath look afraid. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She had known it, in fact, for almost 3 weeks. The way Prudence Halloway had known 3 weeks before the 12 men climbed the ridge with their torches and their lamp oil was the way she had always known things. She had been paying attention. Wendell Pike had brought her the first sign on a Tuesday at the end of January. He had come up the ravine with his sled and a bag of dried apples and a piece of news so small that a person who was not paying attention would have let it pass right through her. He had said, Asa Greaves bought a ledger book from the Denver agent. A new one, wide-ruled. He keeps it under the counter. Prue had looked up from the bread she was kneading, and she had said, Asa already has a ledger book. Wendell had nodded. He had said, I know. 2 weeks later, he brought her the second sign. He said, Asa rode to Denver overnight. He told everyone he went to see his sister. He doesn't have a sister. The third sign came on the morning Tamsin pulled the second crop of radishes. Wendell came in and sat down at the table and ate his bread and said almost to himself, Asa was at the parsonage last Sunday after the service. He was in the back office for 40 minutes. The Reverend's wife let him in. The Reverend wasn't home. Prudence had set down her cup. She had said, Wendell, the next time Asa Greaves sends word that he wants to talk to me, you tell him yes. Wendell had said he already did. He wants to come up. He says he has something to show you that he can't put in a sled. She had said, bring him. Asa Greaves came up the ravine on a clear, cold morning in the middle of February. He was 30 years old. He had his father's careful hands and his father's habit of weighing every word twice before letting it go. He sat at the Halloway sisters' table in the cabin in the cave, and he drank a cup of weak black tea. And then he reached inside his coat and brought out a leather wallet, and from the wallet he brought out 3 folded sheets of paper. He set them on the table. He said, Miss Prue, I have been keeping books for the church for 6 years. The Reverend asked me to take it on when my father stepped back. I never said anything to anyone because for the first 3 years there was nothing to say. But starting in the spring of '70, the numbers stopped fitting. He laid out the 3 sheets. They were copies in his own neat hand of pages from the church's main ledger, and from a separate set of receipts he had been quietly cross-referencing against bank drafts in Denver. He walked her through them. He did not raise his voice. He did not show any particular feeling. He simply pointed at the columns and explained what was in them and what was not in them, and where the missing money had gone, and how he knew. When he was done, the total he had written at the bottom of the 3rd sheet was $814. Prue looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Asa, why are you bringing this to me and not to the sheriff in Denver?" Asa said, "Because the Reverend is going to come up here and try to burn this cave to the ground, Miss Prue. I've heard him talking. I've heard your brother in the back room of the store. I know what's coming. And I figured the day he comes, you would want to be holding something that would make him stop." Prue folded the 3 sheets very carefully. She put them inside the leather-bound journal on her shelf. She said, "Asa, when the day comes, you bring those papers up the mountain yourself. You stand behind those 12 men. And when I tell you to step forward, you step forward." Asa said, "Yes, ma'am." That was 3 weeks before the morning the 12 men came up the ridge. Now they were coming. Prue stood on the porch in front of the cabin and listened to the sound of boots on snow in the entry passage, and she did not move. She had thought in some private part of her mind that she would feel afraid in this moment. She did not feel afraid. She felt instead the same dry level, almost detached attention she had felt as a young woman standing in the general store, explaining to Otis Greaves about the snowpack and the warm rain. She felt simply that she was doing the thing she had always been for. She heard her sister's footsteps coming up the sloping passage from the lower chamber. Tamsin came up onto the porch and stood beside her, drying her hands on her apron. The two of them looked at each other for one long moment, and then Tamsin reached down without a word and lifted the child Ruth Cobb up off the bunk by the door, where she had carried her, and settled the wool blanket around the small body and held her against her shoulder. Ruth's cheek lay against Tamsin's collarbone. The child's eyes were open. The fever was gone. Her breath was small and even. The 12 men came down the entry passage in a ragged column. Their torches threw yellow light on the limestone walls. The light stopped all at once when the lead torch came around the last bend, and Reverend Obadiah Thresher stepped out into the open mouth of the main chamber and saw for the first time in his life what was inside. He saw the cabin. He saw the smoke rising in a clean, straight line from the chimney up through the high fissure to the morning sky. He saw the small porch. He saw the lamp on the camp table. He saw the stacks of cordwood. He saw dimly in the far passage to the south the soft glow of lamps over the green of the garden. He saw the 2 old women standing on the porch. One of them was holding a child. For a long second, the preacher did not speak. The torch in his hand sagged. Behind him, Ezra Halloway came around the bend with the can of lamp oil in his arms, and Ezra Halloway saw the same things, and the can of oil began very slightly to shake. Reverend Thresher recovered first. He had been recovering from inconvenient truths his whole adult life. He drew a breath. He raised his torch. He opened his mouth to say the words that would set the men behind him in motion. Prue said, "Jeremiah Cobb." Her voice was not loud. She did not need it to be loud. The cave carried sound the way a good church carries sound, every syllable rising clean and intact into the high stone vault. The preacher's mouth was still open on his unspoken word when her voice cut across the chamber, and it stopped him as cleanly as a hand on his throat would have stopped him. Jeremiah Cobb was the 3rd man in the column. He was a farmer of 40 years old, broad in the shoulder with a face that had been scoured red by 30 winters of working outside. He carried a rifle. The rifle had been resting easy in the crook of his arm. At the sound of his name, he froze. Prue did not look at him directly. She looked instead at her sister. Tamsin took one step forward on the porch into the column of pale daylight that came down through the fissure, and she turned the child in her arms so that the men in the entry passage could see the child's face. Prue said, "Jeremiah, your daughter Ruth had a fever of 104 degrees 3 nights ago. Your wife carried her up this ravine in the dark because she had nothing left to give her. My sister has been sitting with her for 2 days. The fever broke at sunrise." The cave was very quiet. Jeremiah Cobb looked at his daughter. Ruth, in her drowsy, half-aware way, recognized her father. She lifted one small hand. She said, "Papa." It came out as a thin, sleepy croak. It was the most human sound that had been made in that cave in 100 years. Jeremiah Cobb dropped his rifle. It did not clatter. He did not throw it down. His arm simply ceased to hold it, and the rifle fell into the soft dust of the cave floor with a sound like a book closing. He took 2 steps forward, and then he stopped because he did not know if he was allowed to come closer. Prue turned her gaze finally on the rest of the men. She said, "Daniel Whitlock." A man in the back of the column lifted his head sharply. "Ufia," she said, "your wife Anna came down to the foot of this ravine 11 days ago. She left a sack of dried beans on the stone we use for trading. She left a note that said her boy Samuel could not stop coughing. We sent down a packet of mullein and a jar of honey water and a small loaf of bread. Samuel has not coughed since the 3rd day. Your wife has not told you. She was afraid you would forbid her to come back." Daniel Whitlock did not say anything. His face had gone the color of old wax. Prue said, "Henry Vance." Another man near the front made a small sound in his throat. She said, "Your daughter-in-law, Mary, had her baby in the 3rd week of December. The baby would not nurse. Mary came up this ravine with a wagon wheel hub full of cracked corn for trade, and she sat in our kitchen for an hour, and we gave her a tea of fenugreek and blessed thistle and a quart of goat's milk. And she went home, and the baby has been at the breast every 2 hours since. The baby is named for your wife. You have a granddaughter named Margaret because of this cave." Henry Vance put one hand against the wall of the entry passage. He did not look at the preacher. Prue kept going. She named them. She named all of them. She knew every one. She had been keeping the journal all winter. She had been recording every transaction, every visit, every quiet exchange at the foot of the ravine. She had names. She had dates. She had, in some cases, the small, particular thing each man's family had brought up in trade. A whittled spool, a half-pound of lard, a tin button. She did not say it cruelly. She did not say it loudly. She said it the way a careful clerk reads off a list. And as she went down the column from the back to the front, the men who had come up the mountain to burn her out lowered their faces one by one, and the rifles came down one by one, and the torches were lifted higher away from the tinder of the cabin walls, because no man in that line wanted to be the one whose fire was burning at the moment his name was spoken. She came at last to the man holding the can of lamp oil. She did not speak his name. She just looked at him. Ezra Halloway stood with the heavy can in his arms, and he looked at his sister across 40 feet of cave floor. And he understood finally and entirely what she had said to him on the porch on the night of November 14th. He understood that she had not been making a threat. She had been giving him a warning. She had been telling him in the only language she had ever known how to use with him that he was about to do something that would take the rest of his life to pay for, and that she was sorry, and that she would not stop him. He had not listened. He set the can of lamp oil down on the cave floor. He did not look at the preacher. He did not look at the men. He looked at the floor. Reverend Obadiah Thresher alone now, in the front of a column that was no longer a column, lifted his torch higher and raised his voice, and he began to speak about the Lord, and about the sin of women who exceeded their station, and about the danger of soft men who fed at the table of witches. And his voice climbed the walls of the cave and rang in the high vault, and not one of the 11 men behind him moved. He was halfway through a sentence when Asa Greaves stepped past him. Asa had been at the back of the column in his wool coat with the leather wallet inside it, and the 3 folded sheets of paper inside the wallet. He walked calmly around the preacher and across the open floor of the chamber, and he came to a stop 10 feet from the porch where Prue was standing, and he turned and he faced the men. He said, "There is a separate matter." He took out the wallet. He took out the papers. He held them up. He said, "These are pages from the church ledger. I have been keeping the books for 6 years. There is $814 missing. I have traced it to a private account in the First Bank of Denver. The account is not in the church's name. The account is in the Reverend's name. The withdrawals match. I have signed and dated copies of every relevant transaction. I have a deposition from the bank's manager. I have given an identical packet of these documents this morning before the sun came up to the federal marshal in Denver. He will be in Promise Creek by Friday." He paused. He turned finally and looked the preacher in the face. He said, "Reverend, you are going to want to come down off this mountain with us. There is a particular silence that comes into a room when a man's life ends without a single drop of blood being shed. The silence in the cave that morning was that kind of silence." Reverend Obadiah Thresher stood with his torch in his hand. The flame made a soft hissing sound in the still air. His face went through 3 or 4 different shapes very quickly, and then it settled into the only shape his face was ever going to make again, which was the shape of a man who has been seen for what he is in front of 12 other men, and who knows without needing to be told that no future sermon of his will ever be heard the same way again. He said nothing. 2 of the men, without being asked, stepped forward and took him by the elbows very gently, the way a person takes the elbows of an old man who has just had bad news. They did not need to grip him hard. He did not resist. The 3 of them turned and walked slowly back down the entry passage and out of the cave. The torch in the preacher's hand burned all the way down to his fingers before he noticed it, and one of the men beside him, without comment, took it out of his grasp and carried it the rest of the way. The other men stood in the chamber for a long moment. Then Jeremiah Cobb walked across the floor very slowly, and he climbed the 3 steps onto the porch, and he stood in front of Tamsin, and he held out his arms. Tamsin laid the sleeping child into them. Jeremiah looked down at his daughter. He did not look up. He said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Ma'am, I don't have any words." Tamsin said, "You don't need any." He nodded once. He went back down the steps. The other 10 men, who had become in the space of 15 minutes no longer a posse and not yet anything else, fell in behind him. And they walked out of the cave the way the preacher had walked out, only quieter. And they took the lamp oil and the rifles and the unused torches with them. And they did not throw any of it down on the way out, because none of them wanted to leave anything in that cave that would suggest later that they had ever come there at all. Ezra Halloway was the last man in the chamber. He stood beside the can of oil he had set down. He looked up at the porch. He looked at his sister Prudence. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He turned and he followed the other men out. and the can of lamp oil stayed there on the cave floor for a year afterward, until Wendell Pike finally hauled it away, because the smell was beginning to get into the bread. That was the end of the morning. Reverend Obadiah Thresher was tried in Denver in the first week of May. He pled not guilty. The verdict took the jury an hour and 10 minutes. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor at the Territorial Prison in Canyon City. He served 4 of them. He died of a lung infection in a cell on a summer evening and was buried in the prison ground, and no one from Promise Creek attended the burial because no one from Promise Creek any longer had any business being in the same county with him. Ezra Halloway came up the mountain again on the 18th of May. He came alone. He came on foot. He had grown thinner over the winter and thinner again over the spring, and the man who walked into the cave that morning did not look like the man who had thrown his sisters out of his house in November. He looked like a man who had been left out in weather. He stood in the open chamber with his hat in his hands. He did not climb up onto the porch. He did not ask to come into the cabin. He waited until Prue came out, and then he reached inside his coat, and he brought out a folded document. He unfolded it on the camp table. He smoothed it flat. It was a deed. It was the deed to the entire 40 acres of the Halloway homestead, and to the cabin on it, and to every standing structure, and every fence, and every stick of timber. It had been signed over by his hand to his 2 sisters, joint title, clean, recorded that morning in Denver. The railroad contract the document beside it explained in a few short paragraphs had been voluntarily dissolved by Ezra Halloway, who had presented himself in person at the Denver Pacific Land Office and had signed of his own free will an admission of the circumstances under which the proposed transfer had been arranged. The railroad had withdrawn its offer. They were not interested in the property anymore. They were not interested, in fact, in any further dealings with anyone named Halloway on any subject for any sum. He had nothing left. He stood at the camp table, and he did not look at his sister. And he said in a voice rubbed down to almost nothing, "I am not going to ask. I know better. I just wanted you to have the deed." He did not stay. He did not try to make a speech. He turned and he walked back down the entry passage, and he was halfway to the bend when Prue spoke from the porch, and she did not raise her voice, but the cave carried it, and what she said was, "Ezra." He stopped. He did not turn around. She said, "There is bread in the box by the door." He stood there for a long moment. His shoulders moved once. Then he walked over to the box by the door, and he opened the lid, and he took out a small dark loaf wrapped in clean linen, and he put it inside his coat, and he walked out of the cave without looking back. Tamsin came out onto the porch. She watched her brother go. She said after a while, "He's so thin, Prue." Prue said, "Yes." Tamsin said, "Is that what forgiveness looks like?" Prue thought about it. She said, "I don't think it has a look. I think it just has a weight. And the weight is whatever you decide to put down." They went back into the cabin. The bread that Ezra had taken with him was the only bread he would eat that day. He ate it on the trail halfway down the mountain, sitting on a stump with the spring sun on his back and the salt of his own face in his mouth. And he would later say, in the very few times he ever spoke of his sisters again to any other living person, that it had been the best meal of his life. The rest of the story is shorter because the rest of the story happens over 30 years. And a story that long does not want to be told slowly. Prue and Tamsin Halloway never moved back into the cabin on the homestead. The deed sat in the leather-bound journal on the shelf in the cave, and the cabin on the homestead stood empty for 11 years, until Wendell Pike, with the sisters' blessing, married a quiet woman from over the next ridge and moved into it and raised 3 sons in it. The land was farmed again. The orchards were replanted. The lower meadow, the one that had once almost been sold to a railroad, became over the decades that followed the most productive 40 acres in the valley. The cave was their home. They expanded the cabin twice. They added a second room and then a third. They built a small mill at the edge of the spring chamber with a wooden water wheel of their own design that ground their own flour and the flour of any neighbor who cared to bring grain up the ravine. They built a goat shed in a side passage, and the goats over the years grew used to the dimness and gave milk in winter as steadily as they gave it in summer. The garden in the lower chamber grew year by year until it covered the better part of an acre. And by the time the sisters were 80 years old, you could stand at the far end of the lower chamber on a January morning and look across a small subterranean valley of green lit by a string of oil lamps and by the soft column of daylight that came down through a second fissure they had widened by hand over the course of one long summer. The town came to them. It did not happen all at once. The first year after the morning of the torches, only a few people came. They came with apologies they did not know how to say, and the sisters did not require them to say. They came with offerings, a pair of laying hens, a bolt of cloth, a pail of nails, a book. The sisters took the offerings and gave back what they always gave back, which was bread and seedlings and information. The information in the end was the gift that mattered most. Prue and Tamsin Halloway taught the people of Promise Creek how to build cold frames against their south walls. They taught them how to read the snowpack in March and predict the spring runoff in April. They taught them to amend exhausted soil with bat guano hauled out of the side passages of the cave, which they sold eventually by the bushel, at a price so low it amounted to a charity. They taught them how to save seed across many seasons, selecting always for the cold, for the dry, for the short summer of the high valley. They never preached. They never lectured. They did the work in front of people, and they let people learn by watching, and the people of Promise Creek, over 3 generations, learned. In the long memory of the valley, there were 4 hard years that should, by the laws of weather and isolation, have killed the town. There was the bad summer of 1879 when the rains never came. There was the killing winter of 1886, when the snow piled higher than the roof lines and stayed there until April. There was the late frost of 1894, which took every fruit blossom in the county on a single cold night. There was the cattle plague of 1899. In each of those years, the town did not die. It bent and it lost some of what it had, but it did not die. And the reason it did not die every time was that it had a quiet pair of old women up in a cave on the ridge who had been planning in their patient and undemonstrative way for exactly this kind of trouble for a very long time, and who, when the trouble came, simply opened the doors of their underground garden and the door of their stone oven and let the town be fed. Wendell Pike grew up. He never married a second time after his first wife died young, but he raised his 3 boys alone in the cabin on the homestead, and his 3 boys grew up calling Prue and Tamsin Halloway their grandmothers, even though they were no kin at all. The oldest of them became a doctor and went east. The middle one took over the homestead. The youngest, a quiet, careful boy named after his grandfather Owen, became a stonecutter. And when the time came, it was his hand that carved the 4 words on the slab of pale limestone at the mouth of the cave. But the time did not come for a while yet. Ezra Halloway lived 25 years after the morning he carried the lamp oil up the ridge. He never went back to the cave again. He did not need to. He had received on the porch that May morning the only thing his sisters had ever owed him, which was an opportunity to put down the weight he had been carrying, and he had taken it. He spent the rest of his life doing small, quiet, useful things in the town of Promise Creek that nobody ever connected in any direct way to the thing he had done in November of 1873. He paid for the rebuilding of the schoolhouse out of his own pocket. He funded anonymously the training of the town's first proper midwife. He never married again. His wife, Hester, left him in the spring of 1874 and went back to her people in Iowa, and he did not contest it, and he lived alone in the cabin on the homestead until Wendell Pike moved into it. And then he moved into a small room over the back of the general store, where Asa Greaves charged him rent he could afford, and where he ate his meals downstairs at the long table behind the dry goods in silence, and was treated by the town with a careful, distant courtesy that was not love, but was something better than scorn. He died in 1898 of pneumonia in his bed, alone. The town buried him in the cemetery on the south slope in the section reserved for the founding families. His stone said only his name and his dates. There was no scripture. He had not asked for any. His son, the only child Hester had borne him, came back from Iowa for the funeral and stayed. He was a grown man by then, and he had been told the story of his aunts in fragments by people who had known them. He went up the ridge alone the day after the burying, and he walked into the cave for the first time in his life, and he sat in the cabin with two old women in their late 80s, and he did not know what to say. They gave him bread. They gave him tea. He stayed an hour. When he left, Prue put a hand on his arm at the door, and she said, "Your father did one good thing at the end. He brought us a deed. We have always remembered it." The young man went back down the mountain with that sentence in his ears, and he repeated it much later to his own children. And through them it became in time the only thing the Halloway descendants would ever know about Ezra Halloway. That did not begin with the night of November 14th. The winter of 1903 was the worst the valley had seen since 1873. The snow began in the second week of November, and it did not stop for a month. It piled in drifts 12 feet deep. The mountain road closed. The pass closed. Promise Creek became once again an island in the white. Prue and Tamsin Halloway were 92 years old. They had been slowing for some time. Their hands, which had built a cabin out of timber and shale, were thin now, and the knuckles were knotted. Prue had begun in the last 2 summers to take an afternoon nap. Tamsin's eyes had gone a little dim at distance. They still ran the cave. They still ran it the way they had always run it between the two of them, with no wasted motion and no unnecessary words. They still baked bread 3 times a week, and they still kept the garden, and they still wrote in the journal. On the morning of December the 2nd, in the gray hour before dawn, Wendell Pike, now 46 years old, and the most respected man in the Upper Valley, came up the ravine on snowshoes with bad news. There was a family in trouble at the high pass. A homesteading couple from Missouri with 3 small children had been trying to come over from the next valley before the last storm closed the road, and they had not made it. They had taken shelter in an abandoned line shack at the top of the ridge. The husband had broken his leg trying to dig out a sledge. The wife had a baby at the breast. There was no food. There was no fuel. The shack would not last another night. A search party from the town had tried to go up 2 days before and had been turned back by a fresh fall of snow on the upper switchbacks. They were going to try again today. They did not think they would make it in time. Wendell told the sisters this in their kitchen, sitting at the table they had built 40 years before. He did not ask them to do anything. He had not come to ask. He had come because he could not have lived with himself if he had not told them. Prue looked at Tamsin. Tamsin looked at Prue. Tamsin said, "We know that pass." Prue said, "We do." Tamsin said, "We know it better than the search party." Prue said, "We do." Tamsin said, "There are 5 of them. There is a baby." Prue said, "Yes." That was the whole conversation. They put on their wool coats. The coats were not the same ones they had worn out of the homestead in 1873. They were new coats made for them by a woman in town who had been a small girl Tamsin had once nursed through scarlet fever. The coats were lined with rabbit fur. They were warm. They had been made to last. They went on. The bonnets went on. The boots went on. They packed a sled. They packed it the way they packed everything methodically with no wasted weight. 6 loaves of dark bread, a pot of honey, a jar of broth sealed against freezing, a bundle of dry pine for kindling, a small tin of matches in oilcloth, a flask of corn whiskey for the man's leg, 2 heavy wool blankets, a sling for the baby. They harnessed themselves to the sled. They had done this before. They had done it in worse weather than this. They were 92 years old, and they knew in the part of the mind where a person knows such things without being told that there was a fair chance they would not be coming back. Wendell stood in the entry passage of the cave. He did not try to stop them. He did not insult them by suggesting it. He simply said, "Let me come." Prue said, "No, Wendell, you stay here. You wait at this end. The family will need someone to bring them in if we get them down off the ridge. You wait." He nodded. He could not speak. Tamsin reached up and touched his cheek just once with the back of her gloved hand. She said, "We have always been very glad of you." Then they went. They climbed the ravine. The snow was past their knees. They made the lip of the dry creek bed by mid-morning. They turned east away from the cave and toward the high pass, and they began the long climb up the switchbacks. The wind was light. The sun was a pale disk behind a thin gray sky. The cold was the kind of cold that does not announce itself, the kind that settles into the bones an inch at a time, and is not noticed until much later. They reached the line shack a little after 2 in the afternoon. The family was alive. The man had a fever. The wife was past speaking. The 3 children were huddled in a single blanket against the back wall. The baby was the strongest of them because the baby was the smallest and had been kept the warmest. Tamsin built the fire. Prue got broth into the wife. They got bread into the children. They splinted the man's leg with 2 pieces of broken sled rail and the flask of whiskey. They made a stretcher out of one of the wool blankets and a pair of pine poles. By the time the light began to fail, the family was on its feet, or as close to its feet as broken people get. Prue said to the wife, "There is a track of our snowshoes leading down the ridge. You follow it. You keep the youngest child against your chest. Your husband can walk if you put his arm across your shoulder. The shack 3 miles down has a fire laid ready. There will be a man waiting at the bottom of the ravine. His name is Wendell. You tell him we sent you." The wife stared at her. The wife said, "Aren't you coming?" Prue said, "We are very tired. We are going to rest a while. We will follow." It was not entirely a lie. They did not yet know it was a lie. The family went down the track. They went slowly. They kept to the prints. The snow held the prints clean and deep, the way it had held the prints out of Ezra Halloway's front yard 30 years before. Prue and Tamsin Halloway sat down on the lee side of an old pine at the head of the switchback, and they pulled the second wool blanket around the 2 of them together, and they rested. They did not mean to stop resting. The plan in the part of Prue's mind that still made plans was to gather their breath for 10 minutes and then go down. The body has its own plans. The body had been climbing for 6 hours at 92 years of age, and the body had decided that the rest was going to be longer than the mind had budgeted for. Tamsin said after a while, Prue said yes. Tamsin said, "I am very warm." Prue said, "I know." "So am I." Tamsin said, "Is that a bad sign?" Prue thought about it. She said, "I don't think it matters anymore whether it's a bad sign." Tamsin said, "All right." She put her head on her sister's shoulder. Her sister put her cheek against the top of her sister's bonnet. The pale afternoon light moved across the snow. Somewhere far down the ridge, the family from Missouri was following a set of prints toward a fire that was waiting for them. The baby would live to be 91 years old. The middle child, a boy, would grow up to be a doctor and would, in the long fullness of his life, deliver more than 2,000 babies in the territory that became the state of Colorado, and would never, when asked why he had become a doctor, give any answer except the same answer, which was, two old women on a ridge. Prue and Tamsin Halloway did not see any of that. What they saw in the last clear minute of consciousness either of them would have was the snow on the lower meadow of their old homestead in the spring of their 20th year, and their mother in the doorway of the cabin, calling them in to supper, and the blue of their father's shirt as he came up from the barn at dusk, and the long line of the ridge against the evening sky, the same ridge, the same line, 50,000 evenings of it, the only horizon the two of them had ever needed. Then they slept. Wendell Pike found them at the foot of the pine the following morning. They were sitting upright. The blanket was around them both. Their hands were folded together under the wool, the fingers laced the way they had laced their fingers when they were small girls in the same bed, in their uncle's cabin. And they had been afraid of the dark. Their faces were peaceful. The snow had drifted up against their boots, and no further. He stood there for a long time. Then he took off his hat and held it against his chest. The whole town came up the mountain. Not one person stayed home. Asa Greaves closed the store. The schoolhouse let out. Ezra's son walked at the front of the long line of mourners with his hat in his hand, beside Wendell Pike's three sons. The minister who had replaced Reverend Thresher and the two who had replaced him after that walked together, and none of them had any words for the occasion that they had not already used. So they did not use any. The town carried the two sisters down off the ridge on a single pine bier, and they buried them at the mouth of the cave that had been their home for 30 years, in a single grave side by side the way they had lived. Wendell Pike's youngest son cut the stone himself. He cut it from a slab of pale limestone he chipped with his own hands from the wall of the main chamber of the cave, so that the marker of the two sisters would be made out of the same rock that had sheltered them. He carved the words on the third day after the funeral, in the cold, clear light of a December afternoon alone. He did not carve their names. He did not carve their dates. He carved in a deep, clean letter that the weather of the high country has not yet, in all the years since, managed to wear away the only 4 words that the town of Promise Creek in its long memory had finally agreed were the only honest thing anyone could say about them. They fed the people. There is a thing this story would like to ask you before it lets you go. You are a man, perhaps, who has lived a long while. You have been measured more times than you can count by people who were not qualified to measure you. You have been told what you are. You have been told what you are good for and what you are not good for, and what the world does and does not have a place for. Some of the people who told you these things were people you loved. Some of them are no longer alive. Some of them you can still hear in the quiet hour before sleep, naming you in the voice they always used. There is a cave in you. There is. You know the one. It is the place inside you that the world looked at a long time ago and called strange, or quiet, or finished, or too late. It is the place you were told had nothing in it. It is the door you have been standing outside of for years, sometimes decades, because someone you trusted once told you that what was on the other side of that door was empty and cold and not worth the walking in. Prudence Halloway was 62 years old on the night her own brother handed her a sack of flour and pointed her at a blizzard. She walked in the dark into a cave nobody else knew about, and she lived in it for the next 30 years. and she fed a town that had cast her out. And at the age of 92, she walked back up a mountain in the snow to feed a family she had never met, and she died with her sister's hand in hers, under a wool blanket at the foot of an old pine. And the town that buried her did not know what else to call her in the end, except a person who had fed the people. The cave in you is warm. You may not believe it. The floor is warm. There is a spring of clean water you have not found yet, because you have not gone in far enough to find it. There is a place inside that door where the wind cannot reach you, and where the things you were told would not grow will grow. The people who told you the door was empty did not, in any case, ever go in. They only stood outside of it and made up names for it. You have time. You have very probably more time than you think. The two old women in this story did their best work after the age of 62. They did their last and most important work at 92. The world has been wrong about you for a long while. The world has been wrong about a great many people for a long while. The work is to walk through the door anyway and to find out what the world was wrong about. If a story like this one is the kind of story you want to be told, stay with us. The next one is about a man in Kansas who, at the age of 74, mapped every burial ground of the Civil War dead in 3 counties using only a horse, a notebook, and a memory he had been trying for 50 years to forget.